Vou pedir gentilmente que vocês já vão ocupando seus assentos. Nós vamos iniciar com o segundo painel.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in a few minutes with the second conference panel. I hope that you all had a wonderful lunch break. These networking events are crucial, and I'd also like to remind you that we have our publication, our policy papers. You have a QR code where you can access the information. I would like to remind you that we'll have a Q&A in this panel. Questions should be sent by QR code, and you can send it directly to the speakers. AI and democracy, between innovation and institutional erosion. AI represents an opportunity for strengthening democratic institutions, increasing knowledge, access to content, but also it is a challenge for the political processes' integrity. With the use of AI, and you can also have deepfake during electoral processes. To moderate this panel, I'd like to invite to the stage the professor at Getulio Vargas Foundation, Leonardo Neves. And to complement the roundtable, the former Foreign Relations Minister from Uruguay, Marco Paganini. Senior Fellow from CEBRI, PUC São Paulo Professor Dora Kaufman. Professor and Associate Researcher, Alumni of Berkeley Klein Center, University of Hartford, Professor Eduardo Magreni. I'd like to desire you all a wonderful panel, wonderful session. Leo, it's up to you. Hi. Well, it's up to me. This task has been designated to me the most complex panel of the day after lunch. First of all, I'd like to congratulate, acknowledge, and thank Konrad Adenauer Foundation, CEBRI, and the EU for the coordination of the event. Having been a part of the Forte Copacabana conference since the beginning, it's really gratifying to see such an institution and such a conference become a benchmark. This is one of the main international relations forums in Brazil, but it is also it's also well known outside of Brazil. We've seen some forums outside of Brazil, in Mexico, for example. The Mexico forums are inspired, KAS Mexico is inspired on KAS Brazil. So again, congratulations to Max, to Pio, to the ambassador, and to the staff that is producing this and has been producing this for years. This is a touchy and also at the same time very interesting subject. It's a difficult subject, but interesting. Democracy as a theme, or if you want to talk about digital technologies, this has been a transversal and all-encompassing theme, especially in this political debate moment right now, in this historic moment. There are different dimensions of this overarching aspect of this democracy. And all that. There are things that affect how we behave, how we even organize ourselves in political terms. Or democracy, as I've known, or last 200 or 300 years, democracy has been changing because of a number of technological disruptions that effectively will be demanding from us a certain transition period, to deal with all of this. In this context, we were able to talk with some of the lecturers to understand a bit what are the main issues that, or more urgent issues that affect the impact of AI, and democracy. And according to this, I'll be speaking to Dora. Dora here on my left side. She's a senior fellow at CEBRI, AI professor at the PUC São Paulo, and also she has a doctorate in digital media from USP University. The electoral year does actually raise this debate on democracy, and with the experience that we have, and that cannot be reproduced that we've had in 2022, that cannot be reproduced. Now in 2026, there's there's been a number of AI technological developments that may affect this. Dora, please mention to us, tell us what we should expect from this sector this year. Thank you all. Thank you for the invite. To speak about AI is becoming ever more complex. I actually wrote up a cheat sheet so that I can talk about certain issues. I did watch all of the previous panelists in the morning, and I would like to make a few observations, initial observations. What are the premises on which I base myself to think about AI today? First of all, the power of big techs has been mentioned. Big techs, in effect, they control, at least here in the West, the major US big techs control in the West the research, development, and implementation of AI. This is a consequence, from my standpoint. This is a consequence that it's a consequence of the factor that they control the digital infrastructure where they are located. So I'll provide a few examples. One of them, over 75%, almost all data processing information is based on AWS, Microsoft, and Google. These three companies control the digital infrastructure worldwide, pretty much. The fact that they control our digital infrastructure provides them with privileged information that affect a number of that highlight their importance and their power. Another observation is that it's difficult to separate information. Today, up until 2 months ago, energy was a major roadblock to digital evolution. Now it's all about the semiconductors, so there's a strong interconnection between different critical subjects. We can't think in isolation of AI, or we cannot think of any one element in isolation. Third point is that I don't think the AI is a tool. To call this a tool, Google translates tools into our local term, but tools in English is much more broad-reaching. Tools in Portuguese is just like a screwdriver or something. We shouldn't really be translating tools in the US with ferramenta in Portuguese. It's much more it's even more than a technology these days, AI. It's a new way of having the world function, which is why one of the major challenges, I am certainly in favor of regulating AI. I think the question is not why regulate AI. The answer is why not regulate AI. If we live in a society that everything is regulated, we have to regulate AI. But it's not easy, because it's a new, it has transformed the way the world operates. It's not just a mere new technology. And there are another fourth observation that I wanted to mention, and Ambassador Miriam that spoke this morning, she mentioned one point that I find very important and that I'd like to speak to it a bit. She commented that we should review or revisit the idea that is pretty much included in most international documents, European, US, even Chinese, Brazilian documents. We should revisit that AI should be developed in focused on the human. I don't think it should be focused on the human being. I think we should broaden it. We should focus AI should be focused on all of the important actors in our ecosystem, in our lives. For example, today, it's critical to include the environment, nature, in AI development, because it is the major major threat to human beings. So let's broaden this idea. AI should be at the service of all basic elements and actors that our lives are composed of. And also regarding this theme of our panel, AI and democracy, AI has a double role regarding democracy. There are its positive aspects, where it actually strengthens the participation. If it's managed correctly, it strengthens the participation of the citizen. It creates possibilities for having closer approximation, more effective approximation between politicians and citizens, but it also has negative impacts that I do believe the public here is pretty much aware of them. Disinformation, increase in polarization, politicization and polarization, and so on. Regarding democracy and how it relates directly to AI, I consider that a pillar, perhaps the most important pillar regarding democracy, is trust. That's what I consider the most important pillar. It's very difficult to have a democratic state and in a democratic environment where people do not trust institutions, they don't trust information. It's difficult. In this environment of disinformation, another important aspect I'd like to mention, and we should highlight, that disinformation issue, because this information has different origins, and it doesn't come out of thin air. It circulates in the digital platforms. The main ones belong to the companies, and not by chance. It's the same groups of the US big techs. The disinformation issue, and that's a struggle of ours, how to control disinformation, how to make sure that the companies, these major companies, have the responsibility of curating their content in their platforms. So their resistance, and rarely mentioned, is that it's due to the fact that the disinformation is pro-business model. There's no evidence that there's an interest. I don't think there's any interest in any one ideology. The main one is that it's good for business. The raw material of the function of these platforms are data. And when we interact with data, we create data if we have a profile in these platforms. If we have a profile and we don't do anything, it's no contribution to our business model. To contribute, we must create data. When we create data, that's when we interact. And the trend, the trend is to manifest ourselves when there's some hate message or where there's some controversy. So the issue of the disinformation contributes. Disinformation is good for their business. That's what I wanted to say. But back to the issue of trust regarding AI. Regarding AI and democracy, the major new element is generative AI. It's the ability of the older ones here in this room will remember there's an old saying in Brazil that says, one image is more than 1,000 words. I was raised with this phrase in my head. And you're discussing with someone, right? I saw your picture. You were there. I mean, images are worth more than words. What generative AI is doing, in addition to other ills, it's actually putting into question this phrase, this very traditional phrase, expression, because generative AI can actually place someone in some place saying something that person actually never did. So the contribution, we've always had disinformation. There's nothing more fake than the electoral campaign, for example. It's fake news because candidates will promise everything in order to gain votes. Not necessarily it relates to what he's going to do. But with the new elements in generative AI is that it brings in a lot of disinformation, new disinformation, because of images and voices. I monitored as much as possible the elections of various different countries in 2024 and 2025. Since January 1st, 2024, I've published many different articles in the global newspaper, in my business column, in Valor, the relationship between AI and democracy. And AI has important roles, has had important roles in a major part of elections worldwide, and then had decisive effects in the campaigning in many elections. It has had a decisive influence. So that is one issue. How are you able, how can you face the fact that there is a technology, a specific technology, which is generative AI, which is capable of creating believable disinformation? I have 2 minutes. I'll be speaking again back to the subject. So let's speak about regulation. I'm in favor of regulation. I've been involved since the beginning in it. And as I mentioned, because it's not a simple technology, it's a new way of having the world function. To regulate it, it's not easy. Let me provide you a concrete example regarding Leonardo's question about AI in Brazil. Our superior electoral court has all of the rules. I mean, not all. Many of them, the guidelines have been perfected, have been improved, especially when compared to the past election. In every election, a lot of these regulations are updated. But what I've written extensively already, and there's an article in O Globo that mentions this, given the complexity of the current moment and polarization, legal has a limit. We cannot face all problems. We cannot face all problems only using regulation. Let me provide you 3 examples. In June 1st now, I published in Globo an article where I mention exactly what I'm going to mention right now. There are 3 examples of how our legal branch is limited. The electoral court will one example, the electoral court demands that all advertising is labeled as AI, which is AI. The fact is, few people notice that there's a watermark. They don't even know what it means. That's one issue. There are examples that have already circulated, not even in the electoral context, but the images have been circled, and there was a watermark saying that it was AI and no one noticed. Second, there's the auditing issue. I mean, you can regulate all you want, but you must be able to apply the law. If you cannot apply the law, enforce the law, it's a problem. So how can we enforce the law? There are 5,500 municipalities. So we're speaking about a huge electoral justice network. At the end of the day, who decides if, for example, a marketing piece, a publicity piece is outside the rules? It's an electoral judge that decides that. I've monitored the last few elections in Brazil, especially the last one. And in my vision, many decisions from these judges regarding AI were not the correct ones. They actually went against the nature of the technology itself, which means what? It's all about training this enormous network. That is what the electoral courts are all about, to be able to enforce, audit everything that is occurring. It's not simple. I've been monitoring this closely. It's difficult. This electoral courts network is not prepared to perform this role. And lastly, there's an issue of timing. Let's suppose that we have an electoral court judge that has reached the right decision because there has been an accusation, or the electoral courts identified that marketing piece as outside of its rules. At that moment where the electoral court judge identifies or accepts this accusation, analyzes and orders a removal of that marketing piece, when that happens, oftentimes that marketing piece has already become viralized, and the damage has already been done. So the timing between the regulation, acting upon that regulation, and damage or negative publicity or fake news, that timing disconnect is very problematic. So what have I mentioned and what have I written about this? At the beginning of last year, at the beginning of the year, I had an audience with Supreme Court Judge Carmen Lucy. I was concerned about the use of AI in today's elections, in this year's elections, for obvious reasons. It's a very important election for the country. And we had many different ideas, and we set up a committee, but we only had one meeting and it never progressed. Beyond that, one of the issues that I had insisted on, I continue to insist, but unfortunately I think it's useless, is about the elector and his knowledge base. I've insisted that political parties and governments and media, I have insisted that they had some educational campaigns, educational pieces. It's not so complicated. There are some elements which can show you how you can identify if an image is false or not. So there are 4 or 5 elements that if you raise the citizen's awareness, he may know of a possibility. For example, in the campaign in India, so time is very short, I'm sorry. But in the India campaign in 2024, we had 900 and something million Indians that voted, 600 millions voted, 600 few millions voted. AI was used very strongly. One of the uses and actions was the candidate calling the electors by phone, and I call that hyper persuasion, where you have 900 million citizens that are apt to vote, and the candidate calls you. So if the elector knows that there is a possibility of you creating a candidate's votes using AI, at minimum that person would be a bit more cognizant of the fact. So when we talk about questions, recently we spoke at Global News on AI and elections, and there was a new deputy from the Workers' Party, and the Novo Party deputy always insisted. He was trying to say the regulation went against freedom of speech, and I always mentioned that regulation of AI in elections is against free speech, and I thought that was not true. But we can both go back in debates. So everything in our social life is regulated in one manner or another.
Well, one interesting thing, in order to organize thought, is that when we think about the impact of artificial intelligence and democracy, there's a positive side, a negative side. There's opportunities and threats, but there are 2 interesting definitions which we don't notice, which is like offer and demand, like a demand by voters, and then there's offer. She mentioned the Supreme Court. Like 10 years ago, I went to Peru and a mission by the OAS, and that is a concern they have, how to use AI, how to use technologies to improve their process. They have vote on paper, they digitalize the votes, then who will see if the votes are right? It's AI, and they're trying to implement that, and also to help campaigns, the segmentation of voters, of electors, and as I said in Peru, and this applies to the rest of the world, people in Europe say the same. I'll call our friend Eduardo Magrano to tell us about the experience in Brazil and the experience in Europe, how people are dealing with that. Eduardo is affiliated to the Berkman Klein Center for International Society in Harvard. He has a PhD in the Munich Center for Technology Society. Currently, he is a private level counsel at Robert Bosch, and he was senior fellow of Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Germany. Thank you, Leonardo. It is a great pleasure to be here today. I congratulate the organizer, CEBRI, and guys, where I was the first global senior fellow studying precisely this theme we will address here today, the effects of technology and democratic processes, the advancement of artificial intelligence. And I have here great friends and masters who help to pave the path towards us being here today debating this theme. And I'd like to start by reacting to for certain things that were said with certain specific statements to then start to discuss. The first thing I would like to challenge is the idea that the big techs are in legal limbo, unregulated, not limited, bound by a context of regulation. We have several regulation, but the risks are many times new, and law, which so many times arrives late, as a challenge to try to regulate a moving target in an efficient manner. So the enforcement in this context of hyperconnectivity is even more interesting than to think that this is a totally unregulated realm. And I'll tell you about the regulatory path walked. And Joaquim Falcão was a fundamental author at a time when people intended the internet to be totally unregulated. And having passed through the elaboration of the internet civil framework, currently I have no doubt that the debate, it is not whether we should or not regulate. The point is how, and nobody has yet the perfect formula. We are testing different models, and we are talk about the pros and cons of each model. So we have several regulation applied, but how do we apply this, and how do we achieve this enforcement? And something else regarding what was said before is that AI is a tool, which I don't agree either. I think that the idea that we should use technology has already been overcome, and I see a social technical effect of those new technologies. AI is an agential, the same way that we use this new technology with high potential and high risks. It uses us and it shapes habits. And this is what is being investigated today when it comes to social network. And recent research about it, and we didn't have an idea 20 years ago, 10 years ago, but I'd like to change this idea that AI is a simple tool, and to notice this high impact tool regarding its social technical effects. And finally, and how to not regulate the technology. I have a colleague from the Bergman Klein Center, Jonathan Bishop, who is a Harvard professor who published years ago a book entitled The Future of the Internet and How We Stop It. And I think it was a very good title because, and I'd like to invite you to think about this title and think, well, the future and the democracy and how to stop it, because the path we're taking in terms of democratic processes must be adjusted. So the challenge we had in terms of thinking about the internet like 20 years ago today can be translated into such a complex task in terms of redefining the democratic process, considering new challenges and risks. And this pathway in the last 20 years, I see thesis and synthesis. First of all, it was said that internet would safeguard the democratic, failed the frail democratic processes. We would see representativeness, political engagement, and the gaps were random. And the internet would be able to solve several of these problems in terms of better engagement, better creation of consensus. And part of my research used the theory of Jürgen Habermas, and the internet had at the time that potential. So I think the connected democracy, it was very much inspired by this internet communication power. But how did this evolve? And Dora mentioned different factors. Well, we entered some kind of antithesis of this potential. So we started to fear the connected sphere, fear the effects of the cyber world on us from the private point of view and even professional point of view, with risks such as there being fake news, the excess of information challenges, how to filter that. Today we have the deepfake using AI to make it hard to differentiate what is reality and what is not, and deepening instead of solving polarization problems. So it was even making it difficult to develop consensus. And more than that, yesterday we even came to debate, and there was an interesting sentence, which is that one of the biggest problems on the internet nowadays is that it creates too many certainties. And in spite of being the lawyer, I think the world needs ever more philosophers, because it is not good to have so many certainties. The important thing is to debate, to create consensus based on the interaction of arguments and rational consent. And the way the internet has evolved has made this process difficult, creating more certainty than doubts. And the health of democracy requires more argument and necessarily more doubts. So that is the key to the antithesis, where the internet brought many risks to democratic processes and the construction of consensus. And now we are moving towards a movement of synthesis, which has to do with awareness of digital risks today. And not talking only about artificial intelligence, but fake news and deep fakes, etc., which generate a larger possibility of us adequately regulating those risks. This is the moment of synthesis which I see today, and it is important to challenge something else, is that many of these problems are not new problems. Fake news is not a new problem. Misinformation, there was always disinformation. What is new today is the scale of democratic manipulation, and this gain of scale places risks at a level never seen before by humanity, by mankind, in terms of misinformation and democratic manipulation. And the democratic processes were thought of to react and to respond to a society of human beings in more traditional media, but they were not conceived in terms of there being an artificial content could produce in a larger scale than the organic content, and where we have the possibility to create deepfakes, which are almost impossible to perceive even when it is about technical audits. So what can we do in this case? And this challenges even technical reports. Many risks are new, but the scale is new. This is completely new, and that is what the law tries to find an answer to, and which is part of our debate here. How do we react to those old and new risks, but in an adequate manner, not thinking about if we are going to regulate it or not, and how will we act in regulatory manners and institutional manners. So, as opening a new key, when we had a thesis, the antithesis and the synthesis, many countries today try to create their models to respond to this. Europe has inspired several countries and regions with robust regulations. We have followed the viral effect that the GDPR had, even in Brazil, very much inspired by the GDPR, the LGPD. I worked with Danilo Doneda, who unfortunately passed away recently, working on this theme. And the data governance is a crucial pillar for everything we will discuss here today, because the world today is oriented by data. AI requires to be trained. Many of these data are personal data, so the governance of this personal data was not being well done. So the idea of having general legislation to protect that was very interesting. And that was in 2010, a few years ago. And Europe itself, which approved the GDPR, passed the GDPR, had been discussed that for decades. The first law was in Germany in 1970, and then several countries started to follow the GDPR, and then other countries. But now, even countries which still are inspired by the GDPR are not following because Europe itself is having a different view about those robust legislation. And currently, we have articles being published about that, and they're trying to lower a little the level of enforcement because the geopolitical race is too is accelerated and intense, and they're trying to reduce the innovation and technological development barriers. Here, I would like to make an exceptions here. And it was said in lectures that law is something limits innovation. I here have colleagues like Silvio, Meira, and Joaquim who know that we should think over this and remove this stigma from regulation, because regulation can favor innovation, and there are ways to do it, like the inclusion of regulatory sandboxes. And I think Leonardo is interested in that, the possibility of companies training regarding high impact products. So even Europe now is thinking over some of these robust regulation perspectives, and starting with GDPR, and there are other pieces of legislation even when it comes to electoral law. And then we can focus on the diligence of platforms, especially when it comes to systemic risk, and requires that being done safeguards, audits, impact reports, technical reports to try to mitigate harm, focusing on the diligence of platforms. And now what has been very much discussed is the general AI regulation, which is already born and with enforcement problems, where Europe, by means of digital omnibus, tries to improve the level of compliance also with the general AI regulations. So how will these diplomas be given, considering the way there's a geopolitical race, and considering the challenges of AI? That is something that is not yet clear. And Brazil tries to tropicalize that discussion, but with room to create new things as well. In spite of having a side which is very GDPR, our perspective, our prospect of our electoral response is different, trying to regulate things more recently. But this hasn't been proven to be very much efficient. And now I make a connection with what Dora said, because not only we have a lack of enforcement considering those European diplomas, but also in the Brazilian regulatory response to such important themes such as the electoral themes. So there should be a better partnership with electoral courts, better capacity of servers to react to those AI and new technology challenges, and the deepening of these cooperations between entities, the cooperation of corporations between TSC, the Electoral Court, and the National Data Protection Agency of Brazil, better training. So I will now move towards the end of my lecture, thinking about what we want. I even opened here a scenario, a historical description of those regulatory responses, but it is important to know where we want to get. And if we want, first of all, if we want to make use of the potential of this connected public sphere and of these new technologies, it is not about stopping completely technological development, but placing guardrails. As said, a Harvard professor, he recently published a book about that, AI guardrails. What are the adequate safeguards that we need to implement in this new technology with so much agency power? And the model to create this guardrail, I imagine, would be the combination of the European model, which is a governance model, a flow compliance model focusing on risk prevention, with this response that Brazil has been trying to give in terms of having more proactivity when it comes to claims, more reactive movement, which has failed in Europe. Europe has focused very much on the preventive model and less in the reactive model. So the challenge is, how can we solve the enforcement gap, be it by means of robust regulation or sectorial regulation? And combined with that, I think cooperation, institutional cooperation, international, is fundamental. All the work developed by CEBRI, by CAS, I took part in these processes. All the work that the academia performs, training judges and courts, is essential in this accountability between state companies and the citizens themselves in raising awareness about the risks. The cooperation between these different players is crucial, and I was glad during my trajectory to have taken part in this cooperation from different angles. Me and several colleagues here are from our evidence that this cooperation can be fruitful. Thank you very much. And Eduardo mentioned something, an important point, which is somehow is an echo to the first panel. As was said, regulation is something bad. Well, the kind of vocabulary we can use, guardrails, limits, safeguards, whatever. How do we deal with this transformation, organizing this so it can effectively serve the society? And in that sense, I think no one's better to tell us about it than our Minister, Omar Paganini, who was the Minister of Industry, Energy, and Mining, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of President Lacalle in Uruguay. And he worked on sustainable development. He was director of the Catholic University in Uruguay, among other things. Minister, an important point that we discussed very much yesterday, it was what kind of regulation, what kind of tool, what kind of model, what is there between self-regulation of big techs and the heavy hand of the state regulating every stage? What can we find in the middle of the road that may be a pathway to a balanced model? Well, good afternoon. I'll start by thanking the organizers, CAS, who has invited me, CEBRI, the European Union, and congratulate you for the success of this event, which is totally relevant, and the summoning, which is wonderful. I'll try to finish by answering Leonardo's question, but I'd like to start by making more conceptual comments. First of all, we must never forget the huge benefits that this kind of tool makes possible, and they're of every kind in productivity, competitiveness, and even allowing to move forward scientific research and key themes such as chronic diseases and genetic diseases, even cancer. Yesterday I was reading that they had found a new catalyst to produce hydrogen based on combining information by AI. Why is that so? Because we're using tools which have a huge potential to combine information, high speed, and a volume. And they're not more intelligent than us, but for their speed and outreach, they're managed to achieve things. So the benefits are, and as so I see we can use them. And the truth is that either we're skeptical or not, we're all using it in one way or another. And that is how strong a paradox is, because along with these benefits and these promises, there come the risks. As any powerful technology, we can, always do with them good and bad things, and in particular in the case of the political life, life in society, the rights of people, there are many risks, and many of them were already mentioned, and they dedicated that electoral manipulation and deep fakes. Those are there's a growing risk. Deep fake provides a bigger risk not only in terms of manipulating people in one direction or another, but even in the sense that we will not believe anything, and that will make dialogue impossible. And in a society that has no way to say this is true is a society that cannot have any dialogue, and then everything else becomes difficult. And secondly, there is obvious risk of mass supervision. In certain countries, there are platforms with 360-degree platforms that include someone's full life in digital platform. I'm talking about payment information and also social information, chats and opinions. This, when every data is someone's data is on a platform, his digital twin will allow to find much about our lives, and that is a big risk, not only when it comes to elections, but also in the sense that the Leviathan is able to then control our lives. And the liberal democracy, it is the balance between enforcement and guarantees, making room for individual freedom. So there's also the risk, obvious risk, that the economic transformations will cause every kind of disruption for good and bad, and that the transformation of labor that will come along. This is no novelty. Those changes that can increase productivity, they also make us ask many questions also about how people will be paid for their production when you... And then there's a theme about autonomy, and I think that this allows me to address technical themes. So we are using, all of us, the chatbots, which dialogue with us using a language model, which is the big thing that is built in order to make work the artificial intelligence. So we know GPT and Claude, etc. There's Gemini as well. So those models, they have a dialogue with us by means of a chat, and that is a simpler way to do it. But now they are the agents, and the agents are not any longer a person having a dialogue with the model. It is a software having a dialogue with the model, discussing it with another agent and perhaps with another agent in order to coordinate work and reach a result. And that is a step towards bigger autonomy. But think about an agent that is capable to connecting to other machines, and then we might think about an autonomous surgery. Then perhaps we can think about the logistics of a warehouse without there being anyone there, because
and the ecosystem and the way of optimizing automatically. So these autonomous elements, up until what point do they align with the goals that we want to create? Or, even worse, because sometimes it happens, what kind of collateral effect may there exist? Because a robot that may be shifting some load in a deposit, as the goal is to transfer this load in an optimum manner, but he may clash against the person. He may comply with the goal, but in this case, there are collateral damages. So in this new world, there's a discussion that can actually even be ethical or philosophical. These are discussions that we'll be having throughout these upcoming few years. Without any questions, we'll be having these discussions. And here we have the needs of self-regulation. And the current big techs are already concerned. They've already concerned themselves with not having any negative effects. We have two different approaches. One is committed to making sure that if the result is good, and the second one is making sure that they adhere to the procedures that make sure that in each of the instances they're acceptable from a conduct standpoint. And we have been discussing this in this way. You've heard about this in the Pentagon as well. Also, self-regulation, we haven't yet been successful, but whether we like to or not, the big techs are already incorporating some of them. We have the transparency problem, which is how a certain service is concluded. We are in the world, we're now going through the world of knowledge. I ask a question and I reach a conclusion. The problem is, how do you reach a conclusion in these systems? This is something no one knows, no one here knows. Why? Because they're based on statistical parameters, and they end up triggering the judgment towards one direction or another. So it's necessary to be able to know what was the rationale that led to that conclusion. Look at imagine a legal issue or a medical diagnosis. You quickly reach a conclusion that may not have been reached by the medical team. Now, obviously, including the clinical studies, the clinical history of that patient, perhaps you can reach a quicker diagnostic. But what if you're right? But what if it's wrong? So in such a system, it may be difficult to understand how decision must be made. So technology must incorporate this problem. And we also have the reverse engineering problem. What is this? Is to be able to understand, based on examples, how a certain system makes decisions, makes its own decisions, and an audit issue also. An independent voice can audit a system that makes decisions, and if they're being made correctly, not only from an operational standpoint, but also from an ethical and conduct standpoint. So these problems are technical. They're not yet solved. Some have been solved, others not. So in all of this world that we are, where we can see such powerful tools that provide many benefits, I forgot to mention something in the political issue. Is it possible that there may be a democratic effect involved in the discussions with these tools? Because different from what happens in networks, we can always hear opinion from many people, but you can have a more panoramic conceptual vision leading to debate. So we also have the individual opinion in all of this. And we'll have this in one manner or another. So we also have the problem of how to regulate this. So you've spoken about the tensions. The first one is about how to regulate movement. Everything that I've spoken right now is occurring, is happening. My colleagues here have already mentioned. And we also have this problem of who controls and how do they control what supposedly must be regulated, because this also may provide a lot of power to those who's controlled, because if this is the case, we must also be skeptical of the controller. And here we have the mechanism of position of transfers and transparencies, and that's what has democracy working to this day. Is it only about issuing regulation and having the state comply? Who says that the state can comply? Do we have this capacity of receiving investments and innovation and the risks that we mentioned? So all of this tension nowadays seems like it's difficult to solve quickly. There are ideas for regulating. Not the ideas that were mentioned in terms of data and all that. Sure, that's also part of the issue, but also ideas that are effective now. We're speaking about legal entities, AI agents. It seems that this vision is wrong, because there must be someone who's responsible at the end. Otherwise, we cannot condemn or convict individuals. It's ingenious. It may be simplistic to propose this, but there is this current. So what can we do? Well, we can advance in a debate that must be democratic with an international population. This technology is not which allows anyone to do whatever. With each country must do whatever they want, but we also have to work together. We must put the strength and the power of the consumer, and for this, the consumer must be at the table and start thinking of how third-party voices can certify that a certain AI process is auditable, is audited, is transparent if the results are within a code of ethics, and this certification then must be accepted by the consumers. But it's also about regulating quality. It's a tool that can also facilitate the discussion between regulators and the regulated and entities, and also advancing technology towards reverse engineering, transparency, and also create a more complex environment of opposition of interests. And the only form that this shows is that there are products that control this, and above this we also have the legal milestone, which is elaborated by justice or by the state. But we know that this always takes time, and you must also be careful and not be very quick about this. So to wrap this up, we must not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are things which we must control in an ethical manner. We have to make sure that the regulatory power and international regulation is empowered, but also with transparency, allowing for audits to be made, and always having the stakeholders participate that may allow in some manner that regulations continue so that we can use these new tools. There's no magical solution, but I think this is the world in which we live in right now. Thank you. So in these last few minutes, I will try a very practical approach right now, very objective. A 2 to 3 minute answer from each one of you in the directions which you've already talked about. Regarding the elections, once more, in this in this crisis of trust scenario that you've mentioned, what is your most direct, most commonplace objection in this moment, in this context? What is it that we should look in terms of impact of AI in this upcoming election, a future election this year? I'm convinced that the path forward is to make sure that everyone is trained, is educated. Education is the basic, most important thing that will assure democracy, because there are two other factors that show the limits. My dear friend lawyer, there are two other factors which shows how our rights can be constrained. The first one is that the Superior Electoral Court here in Brazil and also in other countries such as Europe, which I monitor also, there's a limit because they regulate, they address the official campaigns. Well, we all know that the major risk is not even included in the main campaigns. It's in the supporters. It's with the supporters, whether they're spontaneous or whether they're financed by other campaigns. The electoral courts do not have a standing. They're not able to apply the law to these informal supporters or formal supporters. Second, we've spoken about this in the Superior Electoral Court here in Brazil. It's difficult today to identify the origin, the origin of a fake news of information. We've had this issue. We faced this in the past election. We are now in the midst of an electoral process. The election has already started since the beginning of the year. So there's a lot of disinformation that originated from outside of Brazil, and we don't know if only for the direct towards the Brazilian or to others. It doesn't really matter. It restricts the ability of the Superior Electoral Court of identifying and then punishing whoever originated that information. So it's a very complex scenario, and I think even more so because the parties, the candidates, the governments are not interested. The media is not interested in a campaign for clearing up the issues of the electors. We live in such a polarized scenario, so complex that any support about this is not approved. But I think it's interesting. I was in Finland in 2024. In Finland, there's a mandatory classroom in the schools which they learn about the subject of digital media. What happens? Well, we parents take our kids to know. We take them to a restaurant, to a mall, to a park, and so that they can recognize what life is outside of social media. But it doesn't occur the same thing with navigating the internet so that they can learn what the internet is about. So the ability of training, of having training since the early years of what this world is about, social media world, I'm always in favor of this. At the end of last panel, people spoke about education, and it is really about educating the citizen. It involves time and effort, but that is what is really going to make a difference. When we think about education in ancient Greece, Socrates died because of this. And the poets decided who was going to be educating whom, and it was a Socratic method which was about education. Nowadays we think about education as training for a profession, but Eduardo, again to you, you showed us how the European GDPR legislation guided our own LGPD in Brazil. But there's something that maybe we've exceeded some regulation. No, we were somewhat strict in our regulation, and this may have caused problems with our environment, geopolitical environment. How about our own LGPD legislation? Should we take a step back? And as mentioned yesterday, should we do some sort of self-regulation, some specific areas? Do I identify some areas that should be revisited as according to the LGPD to facilitate innovation or to allow more freedom? Were we maybe overly heavy-handed? Yes, I think we should do some homework, but the LGPD cannot solve alone all of these very complex problems. LGPD regulates privacy data. There are many different issues that we discuss in this panel that is not only about private data. Yes, it is a crucial pillar. Today, with the application of the LGPD law, we do have tools towards trying to understand better economic development, the possibilities of the smaller companies, electoral challenges and all that. LGPD is one of the answers, but not the only answer. What I mentioned in my lecture here is that whether it's Europe or Brazil, we must have the ability to respond so that we can close down this enforcement gap. Laws may be good, but they're not adequate to the current challenges. They're not up to the current challenges, or the response time is not quick enough. And we can see this in the in the elections. So it's about what is necessary so that we can have an adequate response, especially in compliance with legislation such as LGPD. We've transitioned from an optimistic vision of a connected democracy to one which is more catastrophic of a hacked democracy. And now, in light of the more recent surveys, we now have an attempt of having a strategic division of how to regulate innovation in a responsible manner. And it's all about this. It's not about ending synthetic content. It's about mitigating risks of creation of synthetic content, and how to respond in a short period of time. My answer is basically this: how can we meet the challenges of these regulatory issues and have adequate enforcement of these actions? Minister, one thing that you mentioned, which I found very interesting, was this idea of how system autonomy, system independence, how they must serve society, serve the interests of society. According to this, and in a more objective manner, I'm not going to be speaking about regulation, but how can we stimulate more responsible practices, as Eduardo mentioned, to assure that the system independents are responsible to society's needs, that are more transparent. Oftentimes, what Eduardo mentioned, much of this is not does not go in accordance with what the big techs want, because their big tech models are structured among the of this. And this is important because big techs have an unheard of capacity for influence. An oil company in the past could influence by lobbying the government, but today a certain company can influence us individuals, can pressure our legislators to organize legislation. So how can we introduce more responsible practices in regulation in the companies where their own business interests are created in light of all of this. Without question, this response, I would have to be a different candidate for this, but what you say is true. If you today or if you are against this, people start campaigning against you. People are accustomed to freedom in the networks. They don't want to be controlled. So I don't think that's a solution. I think for me the answer is most on the side of creating a certain conscience, an awareness that manipulation and fake news are negative for democracy and for the individuals themselves. So we need a different kind of tool to help us diminish these problems in the future. For example, a campaign of Charles Soapbox. This could be done with on-time technology, but we must create the services to pass information to the individuals. And people learn, because one thing is a campaign, with Cambridge Analytica, when Brexit was voted on. Now we have electoral campaigns, which were much more sensitive to manipulations. So the manipulator also improves this practice and creates these big fakes, which is what happened during the Cambridge Analytica time. But we must create the demand in individuals so that the person is true to her form, that they're not manipulated. If we live in a world where no one understands anything that is happening because everything can be deep fake, then what are we going to become? The Tower of Babel? No one can understand anyone else, will be able to control language. I think that AI can work better in this sense, better than Twitter or Facebook, because it can detect contradictions. But for this, there's work that must be done by people to create apps that do not go against the major tech interests, but apps that can improve the lives of people. But that's a part of it. We must be responsible and ethical. So I think that we can, and so now, Luis, we can wrap up. Thank you. Congratulations to the panelists for a very important discussion. This panel brings a subject that is very important for various different countries in the world, especially because of electoral issues, as we've seen in Brazil, but also United States, Europe. While we wait for the photograph, let me issue some reminders. First of all, I'd like to invite all of you who may want to participate in our evaluation survey. It's at the back. It's at the back of our tag, so that you can evaluate the speakers or everything that you've seen. I'll interrupt Luis because there's marketing that we haven't done. Eduardo has Hacking the Electorate, a wonderful paper, and Kaiser has just produced at the end of last year an Adenauer notebook, which talks about democracy and big data, which talks about more in depth, even more than what we've discussed today. It has 8 articles, and it talks about other issues. They're all available just outside if you want to take a look at it. Thank you, Leo. And now let's get started with a very important session in our conference, which is our interview panel, which has been considered carefully by our organization, with the goal of bringing a high-level speaker together with a high-level moderator to be provocative and to bring important issues that are important for the future of society, democracy, and information. For this, we'd like to have the senior fellow from CEBRI, Leila.
And also invite to the 4 Silvio, Meira, writer and panelist. May you all be welcome. I wish you a great discussion. Thank you, Luis. You saw that we agreed to, we'll have 2 different microphones here. Well, good afternoon. Well, it is a pleasure and a challenge to be here closing this day with so much information shared, great exchange. And I thank CEBRI very much and CAS for this invitation, and I'm glad to be able to have this discussion with Professor Silvio Meira, who I am fond of. And please don't leave, because then we'll have a cocktail. But I think this discussion will be interesting, get to know better Silvio's ideas. And so I congratulate once again CEBRI and also the diplomatic representation of the European Union. This is the 33rd edition of this forum. Professor, so I'll open with a sentence of yours from your LinkedIn sign. I still think there's much more to learn from now on than what I have learned until this moment. So, and then I was thinking about this moment, disruptive moment, to use a word that has become somehow trendy, what were the crazy times we're going through. This was very much mentioned throughout the day. The reason for the theme of this edition of the conference being rewiring, precisely because of that. And before we start our panel, when we were talking off the record, the professor sent me, which was amazing, which is a graph by Anthropic, a quite recent one, about the impact of AI on the labor market. That is something that makes us say, wow, and we don't have this on the screen, but if you go to silvio.meira.com.br, silvio.meira.com, you will find that. And, well, where are we right now? So good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation. Leila, good afternoon. We are at this moment in 1950, October 1950, 71 years ago. Alan Turing, who was one of the founders of computing, published a paper in a psychology magazine and psychoanalysis magazine called Mind, not a computing magazine. He knew he published papers in computing magazines as well, and he published a paper based on a single question. The first line of the paper, there was this question, unsolved question. So the question is, could it be that machines can think? And this paper, it's started a research line which was officially launched in 1955 in Dartmouth in the United States, and then we have 70 years of attempts to answer this question in a pragmatic manner. Turing was a pragmatic person, an operational person. He wanted to know how he could think, how things could be implemented, how thinking could be implemented in a computing manner. And in 2017, we found the answer to this question from the operational point of view, with a paper saying that attention is everything you need, which was talked about a new architecture to do one basic thing, to imitate or the behavior, the cognitive, human cognitive behavior from the point of view of answering and systems which were called learning systems. So from the first implementation of these systems in 2018, and since ChatGPT in 2022, we started to have a third dimension of intelligence that is measured. For example, when you take a university course, you take the whole course to be trained to give answers in a context in order to solve questions, be it you a doctor, whatever. And this arrival of this third dimension of intelligence that we can interpret not that as an intelligence that feels, that has an experience, or the intelligence that literally thinks, but the intelligence that repeats the same way that humans repeat. And this creates an impact that is represented by this image, which is on site silvio.meira.com in a text called the graph. It is an anthropic graph which owns Claude, the linguistic model, which shows that in the case of my kind of activity, which is to write codes for computers to run, 97.5% of every code I write can be written also by AI, and even better. So in the case of office work, 95%. In the case of law, 82%. In the case of finance, 90%. In the case of education, 80%. So where are we? If I said that I hadn't learned anything, what I had learned to learn for the future, we have arrived at a stage where intelligence started to be perhaps the main factor of creation of value creation, interactions, connections, relationships, and abstractions. Perhaps we have left the economy of knowledge where the worker was the office workers who applies knowledge to what he does. In the case of work, he manages, he designs the industrial processes that would started being done by robots already in the 1950s, and then he becomes a worker who orchestrates intelligence, even his and artificial intelligence, in order to design this industrial process and to solve problems, cognitive or subcognitive problems, without agencies, without experience, without pain, without imagination, perhaps, of about human life on the planet. And you say that we are in a pre-tension, a tension that comes before change. We look into the mirror and I say, well, what I do is mechanic, the machine will do this better than me. So the big question is, will we really have creativity and have questions that the machine will not? We should think out of the box, etc., and be empathetic. And in a column of yours, and you mentioned the encyclopedia, Diderot's encyclopedia 250 years ago, when you make a parallel with what we have today, and you draw attention to the distributed intellectual capacity, which prior to the Diderot, the press, and I think this encyclopedia, French encyclopedia culture, and which will lead to enlightenment. So the point is that we are somehow, we have become hostages of less than half a dozen corporations. And you mentioned that universities are in this place. I'm asking questions, elementary school, high school, and we to democratize knowledge, the capacity to think, critically think. Well, what Diderot and D'Alembert did with the encyclopedia was an epistemological coup. They knew that, well, the Communist Manifesto, so they did made an encyclopedia, actually, hypertext, and they managed to notice in a structured manner, perhaps in the history of dictionaries, that would have a reference that would deliberately attack the system. So you had something for anthropophagy, and then it would connect with Holy Communion, and this was spread all over the encyclopedia, and that obviously went through the censors. A common reader who didn't have conceptual structures to understand what they were connecting, he was simply reading the classical flow of text, but a reader which had a little more education and concerned about the meanings could connect the semantic network that they were proposing. And the encyclopedia was printed and piracy throughout Europe and throughout the world, away from the control of the original publishers, and it was it was edited, pages were torn. There were different versions of the encyclopedia, like the Wikipedia of the time, so you had a process which was distributed. So in spite of the addition being central when things spread, from the economic point of view, it was not enough, too much for anyone to print parts of the encyclopedia and translating into a mother tongue. In the case of the big linguistic models, what we have is that from the point of view of the frontier models like Claude itself and Gemini 3, like ChatGPT 5 and other models, the cost of training the models is something like hundreds of millions of dollars or more. So the cost of serving the answers to the models is astronomical. It is unfeasible for any company that is not evaluated in terms of hundreds of millions of dollars, and also unfeasible for countries that Mark Carn call the medium countries. So the current dispute about big size linguistic models, those that solve any class of problem, level of lack excellence above 85 or 95% of people, is limited to two countries, basically United States and China. And there is something in Europe, but they don't come close when it comes to broader problems. So what is the opportunity here, Leila? It is in the sense that even in China, for example, there's a big effort in terms of smaller size linguistic model to solve simpler problems. If you work on low complexity medical diagnosis, you don't need a process that will require hundreds of millions of dollars, and even less when it costs $10 to give each answer. If an ECG says you're almost having a heart attack, you can do it with a simpler model and serving with a fragmented course. We're talking about sense, and there is, and in Brazil you find this, and Brazil thinks it is a big country, so we should follow always the latest trends. So the people who manage to solve basic problems using open models, which are extremely simple, easy to run even on a laptop, then all of a sudden they're using models and big models and spending $10 to solve a problem that could be solved with an Excel sheet. And that is what we need to think here, both when people who were copying the encyclopedia for certain purposes. You don't need to print all the volumes. You would choose whatever you wanted, and then you would make a microencyclopedia when it came to health, for examples. And this microencyclopedia had a lower cost, and perhaps you would have reduced the size of the answers to focus. We're not fighting for for the end of the world. We are using, let's say, the top linguistic models to solve extremely simple problems. So, and when we would like to make a comparison for those of you who are from the technical area, you can think about a linguistic model as an algorithm, but as a computer software, a program like any app on your cell phone. But instead of programming it directly, a program that was created by or a program that learns with the knowledge deposited and with information sources, the large majority is a combination of all of the internet, every place where there is information, and now and about every scientific paper in the world. The frontier models are systems of statistic response generation systems, which were created with what we could call basically all the information existing in the world. But there is no magic behind this. They are algorithms. Those are computing programs like any other. And perhaps the differential that the amount of resources that you need to train one of these models to cover all the information and codify it as an algorithm, well, this is from the computing point of view. It is very expensive, and depending on the model used to solve the problem using this model can also be expensive. I'm talking about dozens of millions of dollars in the case of more complex models. And then there is impact on the planet precisely when, depending on the system you use, then we address this in a moment. But earlier, Dora mentioned education. And then I come back to the point Well, to what extent it is essential for us to think over the way education is being given, and then I was thinking about that in a series of tips. So the California Ideology, which is a book from 1997, in terms of foreseeing that this is that a romantic idea about the Silicon Valley, and so. And then the necropolitics, Akimi Beni, the era of surveillance capitalism, and then I would add others. So what I ask myself is, well, I have a daughter in high school, but how much does this reflection about what they do with our data, how much AI used in the data recommendation algorithms, it shouldn't be in the debate of our children. In the past years, we noticed a concern, a bigger concern regarding what's it going on with the youth. But I don't know if that is what solved the problem. But the point is to know what it is about these platforms that we see. And I apologize, we're talking about AI and digital social network. And also the capacity to ask questions in a country with such big social economic inequality like Brazil, how this can be cruel, because when you go to an elite school, there will be the person who will know how to train the AI, whose work will not be replaced by a robot. But then there's a big amount of people where there's a question mark. Those are so many questions within the question you asked. First of all, tell you about the admission exam. It is an algorithm. This is a classic event of a process of evaluation that is solved by means of training and not learning. To write well, the essay is different from learning how to write well, so we need to think over a name precisely, and that is not just any problem. What does this essay solve? It is a problem of minimum literacy, that is skill. Is this person able to answer a question developing? But I know people who are almost illiterate, so almost 815 who were trained by experts in the algorithm of the essay. I think that is the big separation and perhaps the biggest divide between before AI and after AI, because you see, what did AI actually do? AI is an epistemic attack on the foundations, the pillars of human knowledge. So, for example, let us take a piece of the previous question. When you look at the university, what is it that we would learn in the university? People talk about they speak English. I was trained in electronic engineering. It means that in order to become an electronic engineer, of course, you learn the basics about the laws of magnetism, but we are trained to solve problems in that context. So the problem became, at the end of your learning experience, that in order to solve that problem, someone who was not trained like you were, if they ask AI if they will receive instructions about what you would do in order to solve an electronic engineering problem, and that affects the process, because if all of a sudden someone has access to artificial intelligence and manages to discuss in a minimally competent manner, what do I need to go to class? And then if I'm able to use artificial intelligence to solve the problems that were on the test, like in the case of the essay, which could have been solved by any artificial intelligence, how will you evaluate how will you say that this person is capable of doing that? So it is not only because of the capacity to ask the question, it is because of the capacity to evaluate the answers, and perhaps the replies became commodities for almost anything I ask. By my capacity to evaluate a response, or my capacity to create a response that which is only mine, that is the differential to me, that uses data that are research and the data that are created that have a conceptual structure behind them. And I'll say, well, you can start from this, I use this, and I want you to come to a result, for example, that may disassemble the argument someone used, but I must have the capacity to structure this question, but moreover, I need to be capable of evaluating the answer which is not available for the same amount of people asking the questions. So don't worry about innovation, because innovation is the change in behavior of agents in the market as vendors and consumers of anything. I think we are on the biggest disruption wave in the history of humanity since the Gutenberg press. I heard recently at a DHT events, and Rodrigo Paz, who is director of operations, is saying this: innovation without invoices and innovation. Do we agree? And I would like you to respond, to answer.
What is up with the Porto Digital in Recife, of which you're a co-founder? Well, innovation is completely different from invention. Is that what you asked? Yes, for innovation you need to have an invoice, which is a benefit, effective benefit. Yes, yes. It's the definition that I just gave you. Innovation is a change in behavior. It's not creativity. It's not invention. It's not a new product. It's not a new service. It's nothing like that. Innovation is a capacity, the ability of changing people's behaviors of the agents. Let's include companies as well, but there are always, companies have people, so it's about market agents and consumers of anything. When you do this, there's an exaggeration it's a bit of an exaggeration saying that innovation is about issuing an invoice. But innovation could be a change of a purpose, for example. It could be a change of policy or even a strategy in a certain country. But there's a market there. For example, unity of doing things from strategy standpoint. So changing the strategy that chooses what to do or what not to do, that's an innovation by itself. That's a business management or country management or democratic representation. You create new methods and processes in this, and you went to a market of democratic representation and you changed the behavior of people. That's also innovation. Journalistic curiosity here. What are the transformers in terms of? We have transformers in terms of innovation. Claude Mythos and Fable 5. What do you think about this decision by the U.S. government in prohibiting the use of these AIs by foreigners, which is a bit that's complex, isn't it? Yes, few people were able to use Claude Mythos. For those who don't know, there's a ultra advanced model from Anthropic that when they did some tests, internal tests in the company using this model, they discovered that the model was capable of, for example, invading systems that had facilities for being inserted. It was very difficult to discover some of these frailties, existing points of failure that were not known. Anthropic's discovery that this model was so advanced led it to restrict this model for only a few major companies that are infrastructure providers, technology and communications. They themselves, Microsoft, for example, Salesforce, SAP in Germany, companies that supply software that everyone uses. the premise of Anthropic's premise was, if I were to put this method in the rule, if I were to make amply available this model, I could have individuals breaking into Microsoft something. So this model was restricted. Part of it was censored, and it was republished as Fable 5, which is the most advanced fable that did exist up until a short while ago, which is mythos with some restrictions. But Amazon Amazon filed a complaint against the Department of State, and they restricted it. To U.S. or foreign nationals. So they had to suspend the model. We're going to be going through many of these ups and downs and many of these discussions or disputes among companies. It's worthwhile to remember that when the first ChatGPT model was launched, the one that was effectively good for solving any kind of problems, there was a very big number of other actors that tried to censor, to stop the evolution of these models until we can understand better. But they tried to also to stop OpenAI when it had the most advanced model, and now there's a lot of people who are tied for first place in this competition. And now this Department of State struggle is directly related to the fact that the Claude models are the most used models by the companies in the Western world. So Anthropic dominates this market, and everyone is going to will be treating it as a main competitor and as a main enemy in the market. So that's a lot about what it is. So just to say something about what is to everyone here, if what we have been seeing, if everything that we're seeing were to be like a soapbox opera, I don't think that the main characters would have shown up already. Good. This is something that I want to ask you about, because we talk about the usual suspects: Elon Musk, Amazon, Microsoft, and now we're speaking about Anthropic, OpenAI, and etc. But there are other companies such as Palantir, Peter Thiel's companies, people who have money. What goes through their heads? These guys who finance, because this does cause many other companies to grow exponentially afterwards. That won't cause them. We just saw that the first trillionaire was coined right now. So how can what about this relationship between these lords of Silicon Valley? It's a bit about Game of Thrones, isn't it? Kind of like Game of Thrones. We see that these lords of Silicon Valley are seen by the press themselves as eccentric billionaires. And you said that is a danger to think that way. Yes, let me give you the answer backwards. They are part of the new feudal lords. They have pretty much, they were able to constrain 6 billion individuals on this planet, whether they're here or in China. They moderate our behaviors for their own purposes. There's very little income redistribution to the lower middle classes. Do you agree with Varoufakis that says that we're working for free? That we are techno feuds right now, techno serfs right now? Yes, and we're actually sometimes controlled in our minimum desires. There's a process today where there's a very small number of companies that in reality controls everything you see, everything you do, everything that is suggested, everything that you can do under certain aspects. And now looking at Palantir or Alex Karp, and they want to establish what it is that you will be doing, because in practice, especially in the United States, they've already determined what the government can do. Contrary to China, where capitalism is not able to intervene in the state, it's a state that regulates capitalism in China. In the case of the United States, especially in the White House recently, everything it's it's the tech companies, it's the capital power that tells the White House what it must do, especially the techno-capitalist model. The basic idea that, back to what we were discussing in the previous panel, that there must be no regulation in technology. That would be kind of like a Far West system. That is what Silicon Valley people have thought since 1995, showing that the combination of the power of the technology and the technological and the economic impact of technology, the monopolies that were started to be created in 1995, Microsoft, Intel, at the beginning of the internet, there were already internal digital monopolies with strong lobby in Congress, with a lot of the U.S. government research being invested in these companies. And they were turning these companies into ever more dominant, ever more present companies worldwide. When you reach a point where this very small group of companies start defining what the state policies will be, the policies of the state will be, even non-politics, for example, going against innovation. It is possible nowadays to have high levels of innovation, behavioral change of market agents, and you can have that done by the regulation, even by the regulator. An example is PIX. PIX is the most evolutionary impact. It's the most revolutionary system of global payments, and it is a result of one of the strongest regulators in the world, which is Brazil's central bank. There's very few other areas of finance that are as tightly regulated as Brazil are. Partially saved us from the financial crisis in 2008. But we have this PIX, which is a very strong regulatory sandbox, very well structured, and we've been able to obtain this in the United States with this. In the United States, with these major lobbies, you have no regulation whatsoever, and that's the result that we see. We should see something. It's not true that Vale, that a law that is used to justify this, which is winner takes all, where there's some natural process in the universe, in networks of all types, among networks of all types, that if you start attracting a big number of users to what you're doing, that unequivocally you will be the winner of that market. For example, social market, finance, whatever. This was the case in the United States, but it was a direct consequence of extreme deregulation of the market, because if you had the Digital Services Act, kind of like what it was done maybe very late in Europe, where you'd have so many users, if you go beyond a certain market participation, then your platform must be interoperable with others. You may be able to speak with other people in your platform. I can post in your platform, can comment in your platform without being a part of your platform. That's the interoperability, is the European legislation that would resolve this problem. If the market is very connected, you'd never have a company such as Facebook with 4 billion active users monthly, half of the planet's population participating in one sole platform. Speaking about billions, speaking about critical thinking, we do know that those rivalize the world. Today it's China versus the United States. They rivalize with the United States, and China is very strong in this. Share with us that which we don't see, this area of digital innovation, all that. But I ask you, in a country that is not truly a democracy, how is this education? How is the young Chinese education going along? Thinking about critical thinking, for example. Seems to me, to my eyes, that I'm a layperson, looking from far away, obviously, but you could question the system all the way up to chapter 2, right? Yes, you can question the system because of excess of state directing, algorithmic regulation of the platforms. In the case of China, you can question, criticize. How can you have critical thinking in a non-democratic environment? Well, that's exactly it. If you have an environment that is not democratic, but you have algorithmic regulation in the platforms. So, where if you go beyond a certain size in China, then there's an algorithm layer in the regulation that prohibits a certain type of insertion of information in the platform. This is regulated by the Chinese state. But on the other hand, if you go to the Chinese academia is extremely, there's a lot of critical thinking. In my area, perhaps there's more critical thinking in my area than in other areas in the West, in my computation areas. How about social sciences and humanities? I don't have the required information for this, but perhaps to provide you an example of the system, perhaps one of the most important texts to study the recent history, or at least of the last 30 years, this major, this clash of purposes, perhaps the major problem is the three bodies problem of Shishu, which are 3 books in AI, and as every good book, it's about character, its purpose, it's about the human psyche. It was created by a Chinese in China, not a refugee, someone that came from the system itself, and that has been producing, Chinese literature has produced fantastic, wonderful literature for many, many years. It's obviously that you do have economies of scale in China. 1.010 rates at a minus 5%. A lot of it is because of the size itself. I was reading about a text of a renowned pianist saying that China has 40 million individuals studying piano in grade schools. 40 million people study piano. If you are able to take advantage of 1% of these 40 million, it's 400,000 pianists. If you again subdivide by 1,000, you'll have 400 fantastic pianists, more than anywhere else in the world combined. So China and India have an advantage in scale, in human, and economies of scale in terms of human population that no other country has. I think that the problem that China may have in terms of Confucianism, harmony issue, is how can you maintain harmony of something that is so great, so complex? The conversations I have with Chinese academicians, they're also concerned about that. Chinese researchers are also concerned, how can we maintain a minimum of harmony? And they don't think that they're an authoritarian system in the environment, to the contrary of what we think over here. They thought at the time I thought that they were clueless, but they do know exactly what is occurring. They don't think that they live in an authoritarian system, and even less so in a dictatorship. By and large, the party interferes in nothing in their private lives. The things that really impact them, for example, the level of unemployment, because this unemployment level has increased to the point that it's no longer economically acceptable in terms of return on investments. There are a number of people in China that were graduating in different disciplines but did not find work. In the last 5 years, China closed 12,000 graduate courses. Yes, in that case, it's economic and state-directed investments, which is a follow. All right, fine. You want to study. You want to study literary translation, Portuguese, and all that. But we must do it in these 3 universities, which I'll keep at any cost. But we won't have 500. So this kind of state-directed, we wouldn't do this in Brazil. I don't know if it's good or bad to do or not to do, because in Brazil we do have a problem. We have doctors that are unemployed. There's a huge number of doctors and PhDs in Brazil that are unemployed. First among any other country, 25% of Brazilian PhDs, they are unemployed. So given the Chinese scale of this problem, could you imagine to graduate PhDs and have 25% of them homeless or unemployed? That'd be very expensive or very dear socially. So over there is this strategic thinking, long-term strategic thinking that's revisited every 5 years. And sometimes they limit those who try to innovate in an unwelcome manner, such as Jack Ma. He went to Japan to create the crypto currency to substitute his own Chinese currency. In his case, the Chinese regulator took some time to discover it, but if you were able to do the IPO as he wanted, Jack Ma could have become a serious competitor to he could have been a formidable competitor to the Chinese state, because Alipay would have been a formidable competitor. It could have been the digital currency in China. So in that case, it was a regulatory. The Chinese regulator took too long to discover the true consequences. It was bad for Jack Ma, for the Alibaba group, and it wasn't very good for the regulator. Also, many were probably fired because of this. You mentioned recently at the Web Summit about the need for a change in postures on the part of companies of AI, of digital governance and data and control of data. Even before we talk about this officially, you were speaking about a hotel in Brazil. It's impressive how well they have their data controls of the people who stay at that hotel, the guests at that hotel, and something that we must be speaking about. There's a major competition right now regarding there's a dispute regarding who owns the data. So could you please talk about this? There are many companies that offer solutions for data treatment at scale. And we have Palantir. Palantir, famously, the famous CEO is Alex Karp, that published a manifesto recently, the Palantir Manifesto, which is an incredibly cold manifesto, which almost seems like a futurist manifesto of 1909, where he says that technology must be committed to quote-unquote the war, must be committed to power, that the discussions that we should have about this in society should be theater. We should be worried about theater and other things. Technology is there to do anything. Ethical discussions are not worthwhile. This company, when you hire Palantir to treat data at scale, it does solve these issues because it crosses all of your data, transaction, arrival times, check-in times, complaints, dishes that you've ordered, vehicles that you've rented, and all that, with information from cameras. And it will then go to your social media to discover exactly who Leila Sterenberg is, what she likes to do, and with whom or when. It's a level of invasion in people's private lives that is at the service of what could be something extremely good, to have a service exactly that you want, but the service that you'd like to have. But there's also a level of intermission in your life where you restrict it because of the recommendations and availabilities that are presented to you. But you'll never be able to change. You will have forever what you've been in the past.
And sometimes that is bad, and sometimes that is good, and sometimes it is a catastrophic, because at some moment you'll need to do something that you never did before, and perhaps there's no availability of the means, of the services, and of the products, so for you to do that, because the system treats you like a timeline, and with the width and the depth, which is big. This is already a problem in the hands of companies. You imagine that in the hands of a State Department of some or of a secret police, and we're entering a period in the history of humankind where, with democracy at risk and the amount of authoritarian or pure authoritarian regimes are pseudo-democratic, this kind of technology and its use will disguise the use of something that is good for citizens can be very bad for citizenship. And this leads us to the discussion about democracy. this weird moment in terms of the crisis, the system where press is evaluated and science is being challenged, then, which is somehow frightening because you don't have a common core intersections, possibilities, dialogue possibilities, and then you have this polarization that we have been following in the latest years. And you're co-author of the book Next Democracy, 32 Theses for the Future of Politics in the Digital World, launched last year. We still have 14 minutes. I don't know if you can summarize the 32 theses. I'd like you to make a summary. What would you consider most important, and what will you say about the concept of surveillance in terms of supervising from within the micropolitics? Well, we wrote this book, The Next Democracy, based on a previous work we did in another book called The Marketing of the Future, which led to the study about the collapse of the public sphere caused by those who should make possible the public sphere. If we think about naive thinking, the internet is something which is somehow libertarian. All of a sudden, anyone on the planet could have a blog of his own, a press of his own. Any person could connect to another person. The social networks would perform magic, because we would always be connected to people who are not physically close to us, and we would be able to dramatically reduce digital transactions. And in the place of physical transactions, we would have algorithms. And what we do not foresee is what we discussed before, which is that quickly the venture capitalism took over this space and saw there a possibility of growth, not only in its immediate geographic region, but in a global scale, limited by no barrier whatsoever anywhere. It is not by chance that the first thing that commercial thing that we had on the internet was a library, a bookstore. And Bezos, who was an operator of the financial system in New York, moved to Seattle, and he chooses a bookstore because there was not at the time no control to import books. So books were the first things that you could put on e-commerce and have global sales. And this internet mechanism in the first 10 years had this low impact, extremely low impact, because you didn't have broadband, you didn't have smartphones, and because you didn't have the cloud. The infrastructure that allows any one of us in this room to create a digital without app, without there being a data center. And then there was the 2008 financial crisis, and several people were led to leaving their companies of every kind when we already had broadband, smartphones, then the cloud, and the software as a service, and the garden ready for you to plant your trees. And from that moment, then we also start having Airbnb, Uber, Amazon, Google computing platform, and so on and so forth, which allow some kind of Cambrian explosion of new information systems and of capturing collective attention by digital platforms. The public sphere, which was already being challenged, all of a sudden becomes made possible by the digital platforms. If this had taken place without the dominance of techno-feudalism, this would have been magic. The problem is that after making possible a connectivity and almost every place in the world, in Brazil, currently 92% of people over 10 years of age have a smartphone and a data account, which means that practically every Brazilian is online. Among those 92% who have smartphones, and when we sum up, 99% of the people connected to the internet have a WhatsApp account. And what changed everything, Leila, and what is it that changed everything? But the discovery that I could connect the and recommendation information algorithm to the business model of the platform. So how can I make people to spend more time per session connected to my platform, offering them things that will cause anger, hate, and so on and so forth. And then we started to create something that philosophically has existed for long. We started to create information bubbles, but information bubbles designed for confrontation, for conflict, for the collective disagreement, and that led to non-trivial problems for democracy, because the next thing would be to implement, as Baudrillard say, a drill, the simulation that reality doesn't matter any longer, and then you make the collective understanding of their social space to collapse the social, economic, and political space, and even personal space. How do you, when you do that, there's total collapsing of the, or almost complete collapse of the public sphere, then you create what we have today, which is the collapse of the big ideas, the collapse of parties, the collapse of government programs, of the big politics and humanity, of narratives. So then you have a micro-fragmentation which is divisive. It is not the micro-fragmentation that allows you to form groups on a scale which is directed towards solving a problem. And then you, on top of that, their marketing started to use that and to collapse politics and currently the parties are totally irrelevant nowadays. And even saw a governor candidate in a Brazilian state, which is not mine, Pernambuco. The second, he said this following. He said, the problem of my marketing and my campaign is to hide my party. The candidate is me and not the party. So there's no party. So instead of l'état c'est moi, le candidat c'est moi, the government program doesn't matter, which is the savior manager, which is one of the facets of the collapse of politics that we mention in the books. There is this fragmentation, micro-collectivism. There is a savior manager. There is a collapse of politics and politics. There's a collapse of big ideas. Then you have a set of factors that require some kind of a reboot of politics, a transformation. When innovation needs to have a lot of impact, we call it transformation. That is when we remove every pillar for the execution of a set of performance in the market, in the society, in the economy. Then we need to install another set of pillars. So we propose a set of elemental set of pillars, which would be techno-political citizenship, which was mentioned by Dora, and which is to make the citizen to understand the media, for him to understand what is going on the platform. This is a long-term educational project. You won't understand it all of a sudden, but perhaps, for example, it's not only a matter of understanding media, and Finland has been working on this. And you know what Finland teaches you? How you can manipulate statistics and graphs to be able to show difference, completely different from the data that the statistics and graphs represent. This is taught in the elementary school in Finland. If you don't start there, then it will be later on that people have graduated that you will be able to make this person learn, because in order to make this person learn, that you would have to unlearn. So the book leaves a set of 4 structural pillars and proposes 32 theses in order to recreate politics. It would be a merit marketing as a tool for protest. It would be a matter of in Brazilian politics, we have reached a point when everybody is a thief and almost nobody goes to jail. So the common citizen, I heard from a common citizen one of these days, who was went to jail for drug trafficking and was then released with. He told me, you'll see that, but everybody has look at my feet. I don't have one, but many people have. And he learned the following: if power has, then I'm okay here. So it cannot be normal. But how does it become normal? Because there is an environment for this naturalization, normalization. So what do we propose? We also propose a politics as an open ecosystem, the radical distribution of power. We propose politics as a community politics, the local politics. If you think, for example, in a city with like the greater Rio de Janeiro with 8 million people, how many groups of 1,000 people could you have in Rio de Janeiro in order to have local politics? 8,000 groups. That you cannot manage that if you needed to have 8,000 people to manage 8,000 groups of citizens here, but with platforms, with AI, with communities, with network effects, you could make this, and all of a sudden 8,000 neighborhood groups to take care of your local politics. People don't live in the city of Rio de Janeiro, they live in their neighborhood, their building. That is where they go with to walk their dogs. That is where they live. So we lost this sense of the place where we belong. Politics became an unplace. Marc Auger has a brilliant book about it called Non Place, Non-lieu in French, where he says that we started to live in a non-place, as if we lived in a city, but it seems like we're at the airport. It doesn't matter what happens around us, so in the environment where we live. And the book is a set of theses about how and why we should recreate politics, a new foundation. And there were politicians who read it, and they said, we have a lot of debate, and they said, that is something like that, that must be done, but it won't be us politicians who will do it. Because here we buy votes. It is precisely because of that that book is necessary. Perhaps it won't ever be done, but we won't be able to move on with the politics where votes are bought, be it directly with paper money, with resources coming from amendments, or politics that do not make any sense either regionally or we're walking towards inevitable collapse of Brazilian politics and along with it democratic representation and perhaps democracy, because you cannot have a campaign where both sides accuse each other and there's no net result. You can't have a campaign without proposals. You can't have a campaign that will not solve anyone's problem and not remember any longer who I voted for when it came to state congressmen and the book is the set of proposals. Those are which are hard to be implemented, but in one of the chapters of the book we show how a certain set of proposals would be implemented to solve a regulatory problem and an economic, and that would for investment in the city, and everything is feasible. We never found to this moment, a year after the book was published, a year and a half, almost a year after the book was published, we didn't find any manager who said, oh, this isn't feasible and we cannot implement it. The answer is also always the system is hardened and it is impossible to be changed. It is a pity if that is so every time. Otherwise, every time a big or governance system is fossilized and then cannot be changed, then the result was blood to change the system, and that is the last thing we need. Codex Corrup, Peter Thier, those are the guys who think that the Silicon Valley should have the voice and that nobody else would have the vote, so we can destroy it in this system to install what? Their will above our will, or their will to control our wills, and that will go very wrong if we don't take a look at a structural transformation, not of democratic representation, but of the operation of democracy. The book is about, doesn't mention very much democratic representation. It talks about a living democracy solving the problems of citizenship. Silvio, thank you very much. Well, a round of applause. I told you it was worth it to leave until the end, to stay here until the end. So perhaps we can move on, have this conversation again at CEBRI, which will be a pleasure. It is a necessary discussion. I thank everyone for being here, for the attendance today. I thank all the authorities who were here, the officials, the diplomatic corps. It was really great, and that's it. We see you outside in the cocktail. Thank you very much, Leila and Silvio, for the excellent panel. It is the first time that we use this format, and now it will be hard to find such a good pair of people for the next panels. Thank you very much. So we have reached the end of the activities for this first day of our conference. We had an intense day with several discussions, and I would like to make a few announcements. Now we'll have a transfer back to the subway the same way you came. You can go back to the subway, and tomorrow it will be the same, bringing you here. So please, I'd like to ask you to keep your badges, and for tomorrow, see you tomorrow for the second day of the Forte conference. It will be a more technical theme related to the impact of using AI on defense, new ways of war, technology, and AI. Now we'll have a cocktail outside. You're all invited. Thank you very much.